I hope you had a nice Mass, a nice dinner. I know the conversation group that I participated in was lovely, and I really sort of enjoyed it, so I hope that you enjoyed that as well. I hope you enjoy everything. That's sort of my official job. We're in the midst of a transition. This is not like an existential cosmic transition, but we're just moving to the second part of our work. Last night, we started by saying that we were employing some sort of a kind of see, judge, act method. And today, if you've noticed, the talks that we've received have been in the realm mostly of sociology and cultural analysis. And we're about to make a transition, not that we'll leave those things behind, but that the questions that we generated, especially in our small group discussions today, since this is a symposium on the liturgy, we might need to begin to ask, what is it that the liturgical rites of the church can actually contribute to, flourish, and enable the new evangelization to take place? So we're in the judge section of See, Judge, Act. And to handle this transition, we've invited a dear friend of the Center for Liturgy and a dear friend of mine, those are not always the same. Dr. Kimberly Belcher is assistant professor in the area of liturgical studies in the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. She's the author of Efficacious Engagement, Sacramental Participation in the Trinitarian Mystery, which is available at Liturgical Press and is still on sale, and Kim would like you to purchase it. The publisher, but Kim marginally would. Dr. Belcher's research interests are manifold. She's a sacramental and liturgical theologian, capable of very fine, sophisticated ritual analysis. She's an ecumenist. She's a pastoral and catechetical thinker. And I say this not just abstractly, but we often sort of get together and muse about these things. And then I also had the opportunity to be on an RCIA team where Kim came in to present to our group. And to see her present the Mass in this setting is enlivening. She's a beloved teacher of our doctoral students, our master's students, and our undergraduates. I'm happy to introduce Dr. Belcher, who will be speaking tonight on the role of ritual and liturgical formation in the new evangelization.
Thank you. Now we need, all right, they're on it. The team here is really good. I'm going to do this so we don't get feedback. Excellent. All right, so I think we might actually be in the middle of a cosmic transition. And that's actually what I want to talk about. I want to talk about a cosmic transition in the way we think about analyzing and evaluating what liturgy is, on the way to what good liturgy is, on the way to how we get people to participate in good liturgy. So, transitions, big transitions, small transitions. All right. So I want to start by talking about history, because the history of the liturgy has played an unprecedented role in the 19th and especially the 20th century Catholic understanding of what the liturgy means, what it does, and what we can do with it and to it. And I want to start with history because it gives us a good foundation, I think, for thinking about how the concept of ritual can help us understand the liturgy. It's not a panacea, and I want to make that clear by starting with history and then ending with evaluation and pastoral work. So the first thing that obviously, when we think about history, we think of a narrative of the past. And one thing we see over the course of the 20th century is a shift from saying that this is the history of the liturgy to this is a history of the liturgy. Because every historical narrative is always partial. That's something that we, I think, need to continue to take more seriously, because the people that we're ministering to are taking that very seriously. So we'll talk about that. Also, that history explains one aspect of the present, but it only explains one aspect. It doesn't explain everything about the present, and it certainly doesn't compile every known fact about the past. That's simply not how history is written. So when we think about history, I'm using this book, which probably many of you have read. I certainly have studied from this book, Metzger's History of the Liturgy. Can you see the picture? All right. So I want to talk about the tension in liturgical history between two complementary principles. The principle of evolution, that in some way the liturgy develops over time into a more perfect version of itself, and the notion of romanticism, that there was a time at which the liturgy was really, really good, and what we need to do is get back to that right time and do things the way they did it then, and then we'll have perfect liturgy. Both of these principles are really at work in pretty much any liturgical history that you can read. In addition, you will find a principle of deconstruction in the more modern liturgical histories, and we'll get to that towards the end. But these principles are obviously in tension, right? So if the 4th century is the golden age, and we need to get back to it, then to talk about liturgical development is only a partial answer to the question. So what I want to do tonight is talk about supplementing our understanding of history with some other evaluative principles drawn from our understanding of ritual in order to come to a fuller understanding, though still only a partial understanding, of how we can start to generate a consensus about Catholic liturgy today. It's like introduction to introduction to introduction. All right, so, oh, wait, hang on. This is my outline. I want you to see where we're going before we get there. So I'm going to start with a few notes about history here at the top, and then you can see on your left, liturgy's, whoops, that's your right, but liturgy's boundaries, liturgy's renewal, and liturgy's meaning. And I'll be talking about how history informs each one. And then at the bottom, I'm going to talk about ritual and just a few implications of ritual studies that I think are helpful for reinterpreting liturgical studies today. And then I'm going to come up the right side and do how ritual influences how we think about liturgy's meanings, how liturgy or how ritual encourages us to defy the boundaries that we've normally set around what is and isn't liturgical practice. So yes, I'm going up and then in the middle, but you guys can follow me, even though it's night. And then finally, ritual and how we think about renewal. And that'll lead me to some pastoral implications that I have over on the far right-hand side. So I just wanted you to have a sense of where we're going. So let me talk about this book for a minute. I've only used it as an example that's sort of helpful in thinking about what ritual does, or what history does for us in the study of the liturgy. So the contents are these. There's 6 chapters. The historical study of the liturgy, a method chapter is first. The 1st century apostolic times. The liturgy in Christian minorities during times of relative clandestinity, so in other words, before the Constantinian Revolution, the liturgy in the Roman Empire after the peace of the Church, Christendom, the conversion of the nations and the administration of the common people, and finally, stage 6 of the major stages are stability, fixity, and restorations of the Roman liturgy from the 12th century to Vatican II. I think we can see a kind of narrative of history at work here, right? Everything important that happened in liturgical evolution in this book, almost, is either before the 12th century or it leads up to Vatican II. So, you know, that's one understanding of liturgical history. And I don't think it's a bad one, but it's limited, and its limitations are one of the things that has people pressing against this vision of the liturgy today. So I'm going to talk about how we should evaluate that. Another interesting thing about this book is that the first subsection of every chapter, except the first one, is entitled Sources. It's just that, sources. And it goes through what sources are available for that time period. Again, a very important contribution. But it gives us a sense that liturgy is something that takes place as texts in old books. Because why? I mean, this isn't a bad thing, right? Because why? Because that's the evidence they had available. Just like archaeologists, when they're studying prehistoric animals, what they mostly have available is bones. Then they might find some fossilized skin or something pressing into the sand that shows feathers on a dinosaur, and it revolutionizes our whole understanding of prehistoric animals. But they had to start with bones, right? So similarly, liturgical scholarship had to start with texts. And then we did a lot of work with other aspects of the liturgy: music, architecture, art, material culture. But those things have sort of been added on to a skeleton that's already there, rather than, in general, disturbing the structure of the skeleton and questioning what it is we think we know about the history of the liturgy and what's important. And if I need to say this out loud, in general, until very recently, and for very many people still in the 21st century, text is not the most important thing about their experience of liturgy. Like, how's that for saying the obvious, right? But it's very important. So, I actually looked for a dinosaur that was made out of paper, but I couldn't find one. I thought that would be something that somebody had made art of. But one thing I do want to say about the images in this lecture, except for the ones that'll be obvious, book covers and so forth, they're all from Flickr, and they're all shared under Creative Commons. And as we get to the end, I'll explain why that's an important feature of what I'm doing here. All right, onward to liturgy's boundaries. So at the beginning of the 20th century, it was really obvious what liturgy's boundaries would be. It was 7 sacraments. And here, I didn't plan ahead. Most of the time I did. So if you look at this image, this is Rogier van der Weyden. You will see it's 7 sacraments. On the left-hand side, in the left-hand side of the triptych, you can see 3 of the sacraments. On the right-hand side, 3 of the sacraments, and then the Eucharist is in the middle in the background. Does everybody see that? So I'm using this image again just to demonstrate that when we thought about the sacraments before the liturgical movement, before we discovered their history, we thought of them as more or less isolated from one another in their meaning, and as within a well-defined and pretty insulated sacred symbolic space. So here we have the 7 sacraments. They're all taking place in a church. There's no question about their primary meaning or what they're primarily related to, because here at the center we have the crucifixion, and they all relate to each other only really in their relatedness to that foreground image. So let's see, yes. When we started to think about liturgical history instead of the history of baptism, the history of Eucharist, the history of etc., we started to see things that we had not before thought of as part of this domain that was mostly from canon law or from systematic theology. For example, here we have the lectionary database, which first of all, categorizes a whole bunch of texts that aren't specifically dedicated to one sacrament alone, but rather create the structure of the liturgical year. It also categorizes Jewish as well as Christian texts, which allows us to seek out relationships that even go beyond that sort of Christian cathedral that we saw in the first image. So we're starting to see what I'm going to get to in the second part of this, some intertextuality. But again, it's fairly limited. There's a notion of a direct evolution from one period to another of the lectionary in various places. That's only been partially disturbed by our understanding of the adoption of feasts by one region from another region without apparent reason. But we're going to see more disturbance of that, I think, as time goes on. So now we can see, with the help of history, that besides the 7 sacraments, liturgy also includes things like the liturgy of the hours, the liturgical year, the rites of burial, occasional rites, and really any public prayer in common, like the Vespers that you were having before I got here. So that enlarges the boundaries of what we can talk about quite a bit. But there are a lot of things that still lie outside the boundaries. So for example, when we think about enculturation, we have people saying, well, is that really part of the liturgy, or is it just a public procession with thousands of people in attendance? Maybe I think we ought to think about that as a liturgy if we have a public procession with thousands of people in attendance. So that's interesting. So just briefly on how this impacted our sense of renewal, well, we had input of books and we had output of books. I don't mean to say there weren't other things involved, but in general, when we think about what the renewal of liturgy means, we think about generating new liturgical books. But that's really not adequate to the task at hand, I don't think. So I hope to convince you it's not. Meaning. This one is really fun. So time immemorial. We used to think about the liturgy as something that took place in a time out of time. And I'm going to read you this beloved Aidan Kavanaugh passage from Rite of Passage, which is, I love it too, so don't get me wrong, even though I'm going to critique it. So here it is. So they stripped and stood there, probably faint from fasting, shivering from the cold of early Easter morning, and with awe at what was about to transpire. Years of formation were about to be consummated, years of having their motives and lives scrutinized, years of hearing the Word of God read and expounded at worship, years of being dismissed with prayer before the faithful went on to celebrate the Eucharist. Then a young male catechumen of about 10, the son of pious parents, is led down into the pool by the deacon. The water is warm. It has been heated in a furnace, and the oil on his body spreads out on the surface in iridescent swirls. The deacon, who has been doing this for 50 years and is the boy's grandfather, wraps him in his arms, lifts him backwards into the rushing water, and forces his head under the surface. The old deacon smiles through his beard at the wide brown eyes that look at him in shock and fear from beneath the waters. The boy has purposely not been told what to expect. So hopefully you, like me, feel a tinge at least of romanticism as you hear this passage. And I think, beautiful romanticism, right? So here is a moment, I think, that Kavanaugh renders really beautifully, but it's an imaginary moment. And there are things about it that are unattainable today. I mean, I think some of the things that give it its romantic tinge are the things that are the most impossible today. The years of formation, the total lack of knowledge about what to expect, and yet presumably the Christian conversion that accompanies this, and the family ties that are embodied in this, which really, in the RCIA, we most of the time, for good reason, don't expect to find by the very nature of RCIA. So that's interesting. This is really lovely, and yet I think we almost resent, but I don't think it's really possible to resent when Paul Bradshaw and Max Johnson tell us in 2012 Eucharistic Liturgies, in spite of the apparent success of the baptismal process in early Christianity, we should be careful not to romanticize it today. We have little to corroborate, for example, the Pilgrimagiria's perhaps exaggerated description. We do not know how many people actually went through such an extended catechumenate. There was a widespread tendency to delay baptism as long as possible. The real development of the catechumenate itself within the so-called golden age of the 4th century is the result of the church seeking to ensure that its sacramental baptismal life would have some kind of integrity when authentic conversion and properly motivated desire to enter the community could no longer be assumed. So that, to me, has the texture of the real. And that's actually a real I can relate to today. So I actually think that's very helpful. This is what I'm going to call a deconstructionist tendency in historical thought, to say, actually, there are new challenges about what we're doing today, but it's not like the traditional sphere is in itself a golden age full of this, wonderful, perfect community that we envision when we think about it. So I think that's a very helpful contribution of history. But I also think that it's limited in that, I guess, I didn't, this gets us to observe, but it doesn't get us to evaluate or judge, right? Because the knowing that there have been good things at every time in Christian history, and there has been evolution as well as devolution of the liturgy, does not help us very much in evaluating what it is that's going on in our parishes today, and more importantly, for me, get us to a point where we can generate some consensus about what it means to do Catholic liturgy in the current parish environment. So, one last note from history before I start to talk about ritual. History and the worshiping subject. This is another, I think, incredibly important contribution of the historical turn in liturgical studies, and I think it actually leads directly to what we talk about when we talk about liturgy as ritual. So Romano Guardini in 1918, in The Spirit of the Liturgy, says, the liturgical entity consists, and then he goes on to say, it's not individuals, it's not even a congregation, not even so far as they're united by human love, but rather of the united body of the faithful as such, the church, a body which infinitely outnumbers the mere congregation. And then he goes on in, practically prophetic words to detail the challenges of succeeding in making a truly ecclesial act for contemporary persons, especially with people they don't know. So we'll think about that some more. In 1964, Guardini gets, I think, even more clear. And I think he is on to exactly some things we're still dealing with 50 years later. Religious conduct was, to a 19th century person, an individual inward matter, which in the liturgy took on the character of an official public ceremonial. But the sense of the liturgical action was thereby lost. The liturgical act is done by every individual, not as an isolated individual, but as a member of a body in which the church is present. It is this body which is the we of the prayers. So you're thinking, I'm sure, because I would be thinking, how does this actually get activated in people's experience? And what do we do if it's not getting activated? So I'm gonna talk about those things. I won't even avoid that last question. So I do want to say that Guardini has an answer, although we might not think his answer is the total sum of what needs to be said. He says humility is the sole characteristic it takes in order to sublimate one's individuality into the ecclesial act. However, he also says that properly, the liturgical act does not eradicate the individual as an agent, but they retain their individuality, their own imagination and will, and so on and so forth. And so there are some boundaries around their participation in liturgy. So they're not, in Guardini's view, expected to be so humble that they actually obliterate themselves before the liturgical entity. And I think that's important and helpful. So, Let me go on to implications of ritual. So I want to take just two transitions that are important when we think about the transition from the 4th century, whether as we imagine it or as it actually was, and the contemporary environment, or perhaps more powerfully between the Christendom age and where we are today. So the first is the distinction between traditional cultures and pluralistic cultures. Have you guys already talked about this in one of your sociology sections? All right, good. It's always good when somebody doesn't scoop you. So traditional culture is similar to that picture of the sacraments we started for. Remember how I said it appeared in a world that only allowed one worldview? In a traditional world, there's only one way of thinking about things like gender, manners, politics, identity, everything, to some extent. So in a traditional culture, the assumption is that you do things the way your parents did them, and they do things the way their parents did them, and so on back to the beginning of time. That's not true in a traditional culture any more than it is in our own. Traditional cultures evolve, but they don't recall their evolution with elaborate histories. So once we have histories, we've already gotten beyond the bounds of a traditional culture. When we get, and I'm skipping that middle term, so when we get to a pluralistic culture like our own, we're faced with the need to define ourselves as individuals, as agents, over against those who are different than us. So we have to understand what it means to be a Catholic over against all those other religious identities that are available to us, whereas in medieval Europe, none of those religious identities were available to me. I had one religious identity. There was no availability. So that, and there are a lot of other things about pluralistic cultures that are important here, but that one about religious choice is the only one I'm going to emphasize for now. So another difference that's very important is that in the Middle Ages, Christians were part of an oral culture, which means that by and large, they didn't need texts. They didn't rely on texts to perform their rituals. This was probably almost as true for the clergy as it was for the laity, but it was certainly true for the laity. And they really learned everything from the ground up as a matter of body behavior and verbal repetition. We don't live in that kind of society now. We have textbooks for our religious education classes, don't we? So there's a transition then to a literate culture where people are not actually that adept at interpreting body movements, at interpreting visual imagery, at interpreting music, but they are very adept and they're trained from birth at interpreting texts. So those of you who are parents and have 600 ABC books in their house like I do, you will recognize how true this is. So that's a literate culture. Now we're actually in a post-literate culture where people are beginning to be adept again at visual media and other ways of communicating, but we're still, by and large, teaching them through text and expecting them, more importantly, and I'm getting into a transition of my own here, more importantly, to prove to us that they've learned what they're supposed to know by textual means. In other words, by being able to repeat to us or being able to answer the right questions on a quiz at the end of a religious formation chapter, that sort of thing. Being able to say the right words when prompted about the presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and so on and so forth. So this is our evaluative method. But this is not necessarily the only method for reflecting on and integrating Christian faith. So, what other implications of the ritual environment today are important for us here? So the distinction between public and private is eroding. Hello, Facebook. Knowledge is embodied. People know this, and it's intrinsically interpretive. So when I've talked to young adults about where they most feel aware of God's presence, a significant number of them have said, "While I'm running." That's a good answer, actually. That's not a bad answer. It doesn't show faulty catechesis. But what's bad is that we're not hearing that and building on it. So finally, individuals do not live in stable symbolic communities, but they construct their social worlds through a process of pastiche. And this relates to that religious marketplace idea that I talked about earlier. This is a huge challenge, obviously, because we would like the sacraments to produce a sealed symbolic world that only admits the Christian interpretations that we have been hearing and producing for the last 2,000 years. But maybe that desire is a mistake on our part, and we're called to ecclesial conversion. Okay, so now I'm finally going to define ritual. I should say that the term ritual is at least as hard to define as liturgy or anything else, which I actually think is helpful. Because as you see, I don't define ritual as a specific kind of act, but rather as a system that enables people to piece together their lives into something that makes sense to them. So ritual here, for those who can't see the screen, a system of mutually interpreting human behaviors that serve as connective tissue between a culture, and that includes its language, religion, art, etiquette, and the enculturated bodies that exist within this culture. So we don't get to deal with unenculturated bodies, but that's what our sort of vision, that we're going to create a sealed worldview that's all Christian inside and all not Christian outside, seems to presuppose. We don't get to do that. We never did get to do that. So that's pure romanticism. All right. Oh, just giving you a sense of where we are in my previous outline, that we're going back up the right-hand side now, and that these are lined up with what history does. I'm doing what ritual does. I don't think either one of them like totally solves the problem. It's not like, it would be a nice, clean presentation if history made lots of problems and ritual cleaned it up, but it wouldn't be very honest. So, all right, so ritual and meaning. So this is my daughter, Hilda. Some of you who were here, what was it, 3 years ago, will remember this picture, which is why I used it, or I think a similar picture from the same occasion. So this is a picture taken after her baptism in the Abbey Church at St. John's where she was baptized. And then here's a picture of her in 2015 celebrating her second baptismal anniversary. She is clutching a stuffed toy that my older kids won for her. They won it in the claw machine, and then they gave it to her because they were like, it's Hilda's baptismal anniversary. We want to give her a gift. So I do this to remind us that the process of interpreting what ritual means isn't something that happens right away. It's actually something that takes a lifetime, and that isn't a drawback. That's simply because it's of infinite depth. So when we think about ritual, we think about something that has a meaning that's fluid, not fixed. So baptism doesn't mean just one thing, or just 4 things, or just 12 things. We have a tradition of 12 or 20 or 200 meanings that we associate with baptism, but those meanings are given to us in order to generate additional meanings from our own life with God. So, for example, I don't think the claw machine thing should be a ritual for everybody, but I think this showed me that my children have learned something about what having a baptism means, because it has sparked them to generosity. And in a way that's fun. Can we please start having more fun in our liturgies? More fun even with our children in our liturgies, and not just more fun for the adults who like to pray. Okay. So meanings are constructed by practice and reflection over a period of time. They're not something that happens the week before the bishop comes for confirmation, and they're probably not something that happens in the 5 years after the bishop comes for confirmation for the vast majority of Christians. there's something that waits for us in the sacramental experience to catch up to, and we have to keep going back to the sacramental experience to discover what is waiting for us there in its meaning for our life. I'm going to tell a story that Don Saliers tells, so I'm just stealing it outright in one of his essays on liturgy and ethics, about a community that's been praying the Our Father together, and they've just been praying it together, and then there's a big crisis in the community, and they're very angry with each other, and all of a sudden, not even when they're praying the Our Father, the forgive us as we forgive those who have trespassed against us emerges from their memory, from their rote memory, their meaningless memory, with a huge meaning for the present moment that makes a demand on them ethically. So we have to practice to create the space for the ritual to speak to us when the time arises. So that's one of the reasons it's helpful to have fun, because otherwise that process gets really boring. Even though boring liturgy is a thing, I've heard. So another thing about the modern day, which again I've already sort of hinted at and we might not like, is that individuals are now capable of subversion. That is, assigning to a practice a meaning opposite that we've prescribed for it. So many of you know this because you've worked with confirmands, for whom confirmation is this extremely coercive last gasp that doesn't lead to Christian maturity, but to disintegration from the Christian communion. And obviously that's not what it's supposed to mean. But that's what it is to live in the environment we live in, is that these things can happen. Similarly, I know people who've grown up in a home where going to liturgy was a coercive practice, and they've rejected it on those grounds. I'm not saying I agree with them. I still make my kids go to Mass, so I don't know, but I'm hoping for the best. But I know it's a possibility. It's out there. So another thing is that ritual can be a space for the production of meanings rather than having a meaning of its own. And this is especially hard because people don't want this. They want us to tell them what it means and what it did. But really, I think more deeply, they need us to tell them that they are going to have to work out some of the things that it meant. So we'll get to that in a minute. So how do I suggest that we think about dealing with these features, if you will, of ritual and meaning? So the first two, that the meaning is fluid, not fixed, and that it's constructed over time, means that we need to encourage and allow for hermeneutics, ongoing practice, and creativity. The second one, that they are capable of subversion, means we need to beware of coercive strategies for liturgical participation. Because although they have a place, they're limited and they can backfire. And the fact that ritual can be a space for the production of meanings means we need to be comfortable encouraging questions and not only answering questions. Sometimes it's good to answer questions. Sometimes it's good not to answer questions. Defying the boundaries. All right, so I said that what is ritual is really not a question that has an easy answer, but I gave you my answer. My answer is connective tissue. So here we have a electron microscope color rendered image of a cell from connective tissue. So connective tissue is like the tissue inside you that holds your organs where they're supposed to be, which is pretty important, right? And one of the things that's interesting about it is that it can sort of detach and move around, so it's sort of loose connective tissue, that is, can move around, and so your organs have some ability to move, but not obviously infinite ability to move. That wouldn't be good. So if it had infinite ability to move, then going on roller coasters would not be nearly as much fun. But if they had no ability to move, then growing a person inside your womb, for those of us who are women, would be impossible. So it's good that we have these sort of loosely connected parts of our body that allow for some flexibility, but also some structure. So just to give you a sense, because this is a fun image, the green are like the skeleton of this cell, which prevents it from being crushed too much. It'll take a little pressure, but it won't take too much. And the red is like the structure of the cell, which holds its shape. So that's how they work, right? They hold their shape, and they remain connected to the other connective tissue cells, and that's how they hold your organs where they belong in your body. So talk about things to go home and think about while you're lying awake tonight. So what we need to do, I think, is we need to think about liturgy as this kind of connective tissue that's naturally supposed to have a connection with the experience, the mundane experience even, of its practitioners, their private prayer, and their social and cultural life. It has an intrinsic tension, which is sort of, I was thinking of it as a parallel with this green and red diagram. It has an intrinsic tension between its nearness to my everyday, right? I eat dinner every night, and I eat dinner with all of you on Sunday, but also an intrinsic distance. I eat dinner with my family every night, and I probably won't see most of you on Sunday. So there has this tension, and that tension is actually what allows it to function as connective tissue. It gets close to the everyday experience, but it still sort of draws us away and towards the eschatological end towards which we're all headed. What I think this means for us as practitioners is that we need to cultivate humility. We actually don't know what the liturgy is doing in the lives of the faithful. And I know it can sometimes be tempting to think that we don't know because the liturgy is doing nothing. But I don't think that's necessarily true. I think we haven't learned to listen for what the liturgy is doing for people, and we need to learn to do that active listening better. So we need to find out, for example, that undergraduate men pray while they run, at least some of the ones I've taught. And then we need to dialogue about that and reflect on that and think about that. So, renewal. What does this mean for how we think about renewal? It's not just about new books, nor is it just about retrieving old books. I love this image, and I love this quotation, which you maybe can't see. No, I didn't. I was wondering if I made it zoom in, but I didn't. So this quotation is from Nathan Mitchell, my dissertation director's article, The Importance of Ritual in Liturgical Studies, from the text Modern Ritual Studies as a Challenge for Liturgical Studies, which is a German book. He says, corporate ritual activity is then an inevitably messy, septic affair of almost embarrassing physical intensity. So I think one of the problems is when we have Guardini telling us, and Guardini says in his 1964 letter, is it possible that modern people don't know how to make a ritual act? Don't know how to make a liturgical act? I think that's possible, but I also think that modern people still have a deep need to make a ritual act, which we can actually see in some of the things they do. So I love this image for this messy septic affair. And also, this is a fun image because this is an amateur photographer on Flickr who was simply trying to capture a mundane event. Well, I mean, I guess that isn't mundane, right? His neighborhood flooded. But an interesting event, and I love the composition of this photo. I mean, I think it's very artistic, and yet I don't think that was actually the intention. It was literally a snapshot. So very interesting. So then, these are a couple of videos. I have to thank Gina for this one, because she just posted it, and I added it at the last minute, because I was like, oh, that's perfect. So thanks. Oh, hang on. Uh-oh. I know what it is. I know what's wrong. Let's try it again. So this is the gospel procession of the poor clares in Malawi. And I want you to pay attention to the fact that their bodies know how to pray. They know how to pray, and they didn't learn how to pray with their bodies by doing the gospel procession. It's been a lifetime of learning to pray in a way that's fun and feels natural for them. We in the U.S. don't know how to dance. But we need to learn if we're going to become liturgists. All right, now here's the original. This is Pope Francis's visit. This is his last Mass in Kenya, I believe. If I make a mistake, someone will forgive me, because we are a work of mercy. I missed a little bit of the dancing, but don't worry, there's more. I want to point out that not only the dancers, which we didn't see much of, but the boy who was sitting, being carried in the chair and holding the gospel book, the young child, he also was praying with his body, right? So, and that's not even movement. We haven't learned again how to do that yet. All right, let me go back to that beginning. There are the dancers. All right, now you see it, right? All right, so what does that mean? I mean, hopefully, if you're paying attention and you didn't have too big of a dinner, you're thinking, but you're telling me that we need to totally turn over American culture in order to make liturgists of Catholics, right? Is that what you're thinking? Yes, that's what we need to do. I'm serious. I think when we're fighting the culture wars, we're fighting them all wrong. What we need to be doing is giving people the formation they need to thrive in the environment we live in, which is very deleterious for human beings. And that is a countercultural action. That is a prophetic action. It is an action that the tradition we've inherited in the liturgy is very well able to do for us. So yes, actually, we need to aim higher. And so I will say, you know, one of the things they've discovered sociologically about retention of children in religious traditions is that those who demand more, who ask more of their children, not less, have better retention rates. Why? Because they feel like they matter. All right, so the first thing we need to do if we want to do liturgical evangelization in this ritual mode that I'm suggesting is we need to listen. And I want to say right here, so here's my pastoral act towards all of you. Most of you are pastoral ministers who are tremendously overscheduled, just as I am also tremendously overscheduled. And so I realize that in a sense the first step is the hardest because we don't have space in our lives. We don't have room to listen. And we don't have structures right now in our society that make it possible and necessary for us to listen to those of us who disagree with us. But we need to construct that space if we're going to do ritual evangelization. So 2 things. The first thing I think is we need to listen to decolonizing cultures. In other words, cultures that are grappling with a history of oppression. So we've seen that with Pope Francis, his lifting up of South American insights. I think I showed you a little bit of, what we need to think about from our African sisters and brothers. I think if we look at the African American church in the United States, if we look at Latinos in the United States, I've studied the Syro-Malabar Rite in the United States, which is an Indian rite. These are all people who are struggling with a history of being under oppression, and they have a lot of survival techniques that are community building techniques, that are community transforming techniques, that are ways of dealing with the conflicts of identity that Americans, Christians in the United States are grappling with today. So I think we need to listen to them. We also need to listen to those we minister to. So we need to find out from them what is happening in their lives. What is their narrative? What is the meaning that they see? And then we need to dialogue with that and not dismiss it. It might be partial, but it's not good ministry to dismiss the partial as wrong. The partial isn't wrong, it's a step on the road of reflection. So when we're doing ministry, what we need to do is build up the partial and lead the partial forward towards more strong association of our understanding of the faith. We need to foster body practice. So we are starting to see this. There is not a lot of comfort in the United States for body practice in the Eucharist, and that's fine. Not everything has to happen in the Eucharist. Somehow I feel sure that you've said that already this weekend, some of you, or this week. What day is it? So that's fine. But body practice has to be part of what we do because we are embodied creatures, and we remember things better if we do them with our bodies than if we do them just with our minds. One of the things I've been thinking about is how our culture relearns how to process, because when we process, we also process. And I think part of we have record levels of anxiety in the United States culture today, and I think part of the reason is because we don't have the skills to cope with the stresses that we're putting ourselves through. So I was thinking about procession. Here is another, okay, I did do this. All right, I wasn't sure if I have to walk over there. So here's a procession. Again, this is an amateur photographer on Flickr. I want to think about what this image says about the act of procession. This is outside the building, and we can't even see the individuals, right? We just see the trace they leave behind. I think that's kind of helpful in thinking about liturgy, sort of sparking our imagination to work with liturgy. I'll say more about that in a minute. I love this image. So here is a creative interpretation of a procession. Pat Gaines, his photograph called Procession. I think we need to think about photography as a way of expressing and reflecting on and integrating people's human lives. This is one of the things that people use these days to link the public and the private, the mundane and the festive. This is part of the connective tissue of contemporary American Christians. I'll get to more of that in a minute, I hope. So we need to reflect. Reflection means remembering. One of the things I would like is for us to start thinking about the opportunity to use photography for big life passage moments as a means of ongoing reflection with the church. Like, instead of stigmatizing photography at life passage moments in the church. We need to think about ways to do it respectfully and non-intrusively, and then to use that imagery that's produced later to assist people in ongoing reflection on their liturgical experience and what it means to them. And then that means we need to speak a common language, and we need to speak from our own experience, which I have at least tried to do tonight. I wanted to finish, I'm leaving some time for questions, I think, yeah? Yes. But I wanted to finish with two images that I would say provide potential theologies of church from a nonverbal perspective. So here's one, and here's the other. They're dramatically different, and I'm talking about the photograph as art. I'm not talking about the architecture as art. I'm talking about the photograph as art that expresses a conviction about what church is. So let's look at this first image. And I guess I'll transition seamlessly into questions by saying, what do you see? You see the pastoral candle at the center, and that is a choice on the part of the photographer, right? It's possible for the photographer to go, boy, that thing's in my way. I'm going to stand in front of it to take a picture of the apse. Many people would have. This photographer did not. Okay, what else? The wreaths. Okay, so we have the liturgical year is evident. Again, it's possible for a photographer to see evidence of the liturgical year as a distraction from the object, but that doesn't seem to be the case here. What else? Movement. Great. Yes, this isn't a stark, empty church, which is the vast majority of pictures that you see on Flickr under the title church, by the way. So I like this one because there are people here, and they seem to be moving. Yes?
Symmetry?
Yeah? Yes. Yeah, symmetry, right-left symmetry, right? Yes.
There's an enormity to the whole photo that it's bigger than the first glance.
Yeah, say more about that.
I mean, it looks like you're looking just at a simple picture of a church, but then as you delve into it, you can see that the higher art pieces, just the sheer enormity of the church, where your eye is focused towards the people on one level, and then there's the grander image of the rest of the space.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I like that. So the space frames the image, the people provide scale and a focal point. It doesn't distract from the enormity. It actually sort of calls your attention. Is that what you're getting at? Yeah, I think that's very helpful.
So it's a vertical and a horizontal component. The other hand draws us to God, it draws you to the church.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And I think that's probably why I like this image, that those two don't have to be in competition. Yeah.
I like that there are people in it, but it's not a liturgical moment.
Yeah. Probably because you're discouraged from taking pictures of liturgical moments. But
It means that church doesn't just happen to be liturgy.
that's right. No, that's right. And this goes with the ongoing reflection, right? So the experience we have of churches in church buildings, in non-liturgical moments, but also church communities, in non-liturgical moments contributes to what the liturgy means. That's part of the intertextuality of our post-literate culture. But it was probably always part of it. If you get a card when somebody in your family dies from somebody at your church, your next experience of worship is more meaningful. Oh, we got two here in the front, and then yeah, there's some highlights of light, but there's also a kind of flood of light in this image. I didn't see who else was speaking. Yes. Right, and that's part of the artistry of the artist, right? Because they control the color balance, and this is obviously not the natural color balance.
It's unfinished too. To part of my eye, it feels like an unfinished piece because as pastor, usually we walk in the church and I see just a handful of folks. I'm like, where is everybody? And I'm waiting for the life of the building.
Yeah, this is an in-between time. It's a transitional moment. Yeah, I agree with you. Oh, over here.
Yeah, but for some reason, although I see that, although it feel empty.
Yeah.
Although it's empty,
I think you're seeing. You can see the liturgical assembly, even though the liturgical assembly isn't there. It's got a trace there. Yeah.
You can kind of see 3 stages too, because it looks like some people are leaving, some people are sitting and praying, and others are just now moving into it.
Yeah, this is a pilgrimage church, and here we have, these are clearly, maybe not all, but we can imagine that there are people who are, pilgriming, they're visiting. Yeah. Is that enough? Should we look at the other one? What's this? What's that? Yeah, I am too. So, and the photographer has made certain choices that make the cemetery a really distinctive and important part of his picture of church. I think he was a man. What are the choices? Are the frame, right? He doesn't take it head on where you would see the path and not much of the cemetery. He doesn't marginalize the cemetery. He puts you as a viewer right in the midst of the cemetery. And it's low, so the graves kind of loom for you. Hopefully not at you, but for you.
It looks like the lights are on, but I'm not sure if there's anyone there.
As the saying goes. That's right. Right, and I'm assuming that pink light is a result of photography magic on the photographer's part.
I like that he captured the movement in the snow.
I think they're stars, actually. I think this is, it's a long exposure photograph because it's dark. Yeah, but I agree with you. I like the procession of the stars in this image. Gina.
It's hard to tell what the scale is. Like, it almost looks like a big dollhouse. I mean, how big is a human compared to a gravestone compared to
Yeah, that's right. So if you look at the bench in front, so Gina, I'm remembering not all of you have mics. Gina says, it's hard to tell the scale. It almost looks like a dollhouse. If you look at that bench in the front, I think that's our sole clue to the scale of the building. Do you see the bench? I probably have it. Hey, look at that. Here's our bench. But yeah, that looks very small compared to the graves. And it also is, obviously, it's a small building, right? So if that's it's a very small bench. Yeah, that's right. So the shadows in the cemetery. It's a dark image overall, despite the effort that the photographer's obviously gone to make it brighter.
It's captured at between times, like either dusk or dawn. It's like between darkness and light.
Yeah, it's a twilight time, if you will. I see I picked 2 transitional photographs, and I didn't mean to when I did this, so that's interesting. In the back, in blue, yes.
Verticality?
Yes. Yeah, it's because, other one. Because those columns really zoom up, it gives you an image of verticality that almost is more so than that first image where everything is vertical. Great.
To me, the fact that the church is illuminated, I'm assuming there are people inside and they're saying glory or something. And also the gravestones are illuminated. To me, that tells me that whole significance for the community of saints.
Yeah. So see, we've already gotten to a theology, right? This has an emotional valence that in a sense allows us to see theological reflection in the image. All right, one more, and then we'll go to general questions. No, as usual, no one wants to be last.
So it appears that the church is standing between the earthly and the infinite, between earth and heaven. And I guess to start off the general questions, you said that we're developing a theology from the picture, but other people would look at this picture and come up with a completely different theology. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Exactly. Thank you. That was my segue. I didn't plan it, I promise. Yeah, so we're developing a theology. We're reading a theology in the picture. Other people who, well, first of all, if you're scanning through pictures in Flickr, just like if you're walking through a museum, it's possible to read nothing in the image. You can just walk on by, as it were, right? So it takes a sustained gaze to generate theological meaning in one of these images. And it's also possible not only that other people would read it differently, but that the photographer had nothing of the sort in mind when he took the photo. In fact, I've been a photographer. I can say some of my best pictures. I'm a very amateur photographer, so this shouldn't, your mileage may vary, as they say. But some of my best pictures are ones that I did not at all expect to come out at all. And then they turn out to be meaningful after the fact. That's why it's important to develop an interpretive community that can think with us theologically about what our liturgy means. So the photographer took the picture, uploaded it to Flickr, released it via Creative Commons to the world. I selected the picture and said, this is a picture that's important for some reason. But I didn't generate all the thoughts that you all just generated from it. I just said, this is a picture that has a lot in it. I put it up on there, and then we came together as an interpretive community, and we generated a lot of theological insights from that picture that we're reading against our tradition, right? So we're not generating theological insights from the picture. We're generating them out of the picture, if you will, but against the horizon of our common tradition, right? That's the work we need to start doing as liturgists within our parishes. We need to start getting together and generating reflection on our rites. And it takes a sustained gaze, which, yes, means that people are going to have to be there for at least, 2 or 3 minutes, right? That's about how long it took you. And yes, it does, but it doesn't have to be a large group of people, right? It just has to be enough people to generate theological reflection. But that would be a good use of our time.
Are there other thoughts or questions? I think that's the transition.
Oh, one more.
So getting people together to gaze, right? And to interpret, like what would that produce, or what would that, you know what I mean? Like this,
I do.
So if that happens in communities, how would that then affect how we look at liturgy or how we communicate to others?
So one of the things it does is that it generates a stronger and, if you will, realer liturgical assembly. Because people who have done reflection together on what their common worship means are better able to worship together thereafter. This doesn't need a defense, does it? Does it seem obvious? But when we reflect together theologically, we become a better assembly. And then we pray better. The other thing that I think is just as important is that it allows, so it takes that sustained gaze, right, for the liturgy to come alive, for that moment to happen that I talked about with Don Salier's story, where you go from the rote repetition to something that actually existentially relates to the things I did yesterday, I'm doing today, and I'm thinking about doing next week. And doing that together is part of how the church as a community of communities has been built up over time. So it's better not to do that out of a book in our armchairs, although there's nothing wrong with armchair liturgy either, as a supplement, if you will. But I think that the generation of communal insight and insight that's enlivened by and brought to fruition by the Holy Spirit is work that Christians do in common.
I guess this is more a comment. I'm really energized by this idea that as liturgists we need to gather interpretive communities, to help all of us understand what we're doing liturgically. But it occurs to me that we would do well to have multiple interpretive communities. And we talked a little bit earlier in the symposium about how we staff our parishes, how we compensate or don't compensate the staffs of our parishes. So what would it mean for youth ministers to be, or catechists to be reflecting with young people on what liturgy means, or a group of young parents? You'll have these multiple meanings.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful. So I have nothing to say, but yes, I think that would be great. And it's the other thing about this kind of communal reflection on ritual. So ritual formation begins with action, right? Hopefully repetitive action, and comes to fulfillment in reflection, right? So maybe we have to add one to your 3-part. See, observe, act, and reflect. I know that's not canonical, but I've encouraged creativity, so here we have it. So I think one of the things that's helpful about that is it is a leveling motion. So I do this with my children. My children are 9, 7, and 3. And I'm a professional liturgist with a PhD for what that's worth. And they routinely challenge me, not because they have better answers than the answers I have, but because they have better questions than the ones I thought of. So I think actually we should have diverse communities, and then we should be informed by all of our diverse communities, because I think it's good for us.
I belong to an international congregation of women religious, so I've had an opportunity to see some variety. One of the gifts that I had recently, some sisters from Rwanda came from Buffalo, New York area, and I loved it. I love when guests come and I can take them around and see Niagara Falls. So we actually went down the Maid of Mist, which is a boat that goes right down under the Thundering Falls. And I'm on the top deck with these sisters, and they're all in their habits. We all have the blue raincoats on. And in the moment of that being in the face of Niagara Falls looming over us, they break into song. Beautiful, beautiful song. And the people, we wonderfully stiff North Americans, are all just standing around and backing away from this crowd. So all of a sudden they're praising God. It was wonderful. And all I could do, they're from Africa, they do this.
That's wonderful. Yes. Can you please put that religion back in a box? That's making me
I think there's something in your presentation about how ritual kind of disturbs us as well, especially when it comes from outside. Like the video you played there for the papal mass, we're really sitting there like, good God, what's happening? And that, there's a sense of that again, like when folks show up at my parish, white folks show up, they're like, what is going, they kind of look around like, what is going on? But it's the ritual of that community, the way they come together, they decided this is the way things are going to go. And people, it really does stretch them a bit more to see the grand nature of the body of Christ and how large it is. Just that sense of, the nuns, breaking the song and doing that stuff. I think we need a lot more of that. I used to teach the deacons in formation in the diocese. In the first class, we would always go through a bunch of basic liturgical stuff. And then I'd turn on disco music and ask them to just stand up and do like a Soul Train line. And watching a bunch of older white guys go dancing in the Soul Train line, for the most part, they couldn't move. And I would always say, if you can't move to something this simple, the liturgy is going to always be technology seems, you know. And then there are these guys who walk around like little robots. And I think that saddens me that we don't have that, but how that starts to make us more understanding of the depth and the breadth of the body.
Yeah, you had your hand up first.
Yeah, thank you. This was such a really stimulating, creative presentation. I really appreciate it. So in the video from the Papal Mass, right? What we saw there was this natural expression of that culture being, or at least something that was that people who weren't religious would recognize that in that culture, right?
Yeah.
So
an elevated or solemnified expression of the dance that's endemic. Yes.
yeah. So what sort of things do you see as parallels in our own culture that could be incorporated, with the caveat that you said American culture was like utterly destructive to Christian faith?
Well,
Something like that.
I didn't say that, did I? I didn't mean that if I said it.
You said that maybe there's aspects of our culture.
Yeah, I mean, the embodied movement thing is something that white Westerners unlearned at the Enlightenment and have basically haven't relearned. And unfortunately, Christian liturgical action and reflection is bound up with embodied disciplines that are themselves helpful in doing theological reflection. And so that aspect, yes, I wouldn't say that, you know, I certainly don't think that contemporary American culture is totally destructive of everything liturgical. I mean, for one thing, like we have a 99% literacy rate, which is kind of nice because people can read. That's really helpful, even though we are in a post-literate culture and everything, and we might long for an oral culture, but I'm actually quite happy that we have such a high literacy rate. So, but I think, I'm trying to remember the actual question. I got distracted by that.
What's maybe you could suggest some parallels
Yeah.
that are natural to us,
Right.
that are not yet really kind of very present?
Well, some things that I found with my own undergraduate students, and also to some extent in working with like our CIA program and other groups like that, are people who are athletes and people who are musicians. They understand doing things again and again, straining after a meaning that sort of eventually comes, but never really in its entirety, right? I mean, you never perfectly perform. And so there's that, I wouldn't say it's an eschatological dimension, but there's that human reality that ripens into an eschatological dimension in the Christian liturgy. So I think that's something that's helpful. I also think, actually, the fact that people are so anxious and so fearful and so isolated makes them desire precisely those relationships and those dispositions that the liturgy requires. So I'm not entirely happy that we live in a culture where lots of people are anxious, fearful, and alone. But I do think the liturgy has a lot to say to people who find themselves in that existential place.
So, friends, this will be the last comment, and then we will.
Well, now that was the question.
Right, but you've already volunteered, so you can't unvolunteer yourself.
Well, I think having these groups of interpretive communities that reflect kind of in natural and ways on the rites and the liturgies would, over time, have a really positive effect on the preachers in the community. Because listening to those conversations, I think preachers know that the liturgical texts are appropriate preaching texts, but they so seldom do that. And I think that would encourage preachers to do that, and I think over time, that would have a really wonderful effect on preaching.
Yeah, and I do too, and that's hard on our preachers, right? So for those of you who are preachers, that doesn't mean more pressure, it means less pressure, right? So you get to reflect with other people, and that's more productive. I think there's already enough pressure on our preachers. Yeah. So yeah, so my final thing, which I forgot to say, is that to do ritual evangelization is to assist people in liturgy, not to assess people in liturgy.